The sun over Juniper Draw was a merciless hammer, beating the heat into the cracked earth until the air itself seemed to ripple and warp. It baked the dust to a fine, red powder that coated everything. A second skin on the brittle grass and the splintered bones of the fence that marked the edge of the Dry Lantern Ranch. The only sound to defy the oppressive silence was the long, mournful complaint of the windmill. Its metal blades, rusted the color of old blood, turned in a slow, agonizing protest against the wind. A sound like a single cello string stretched to its breaking point. It was a sound of thirst, of endurance, of a land that gave nothing easily. Into this tableau of heat and stillness, a figure stumbled, a woman. She moved not like she was walking, but like she was being pushed from behind by a terror she had only just outrun. She scrambled through a gap in the broken fence, her feet catching on the weathered gray wood, nearly sending her to her knees. Her shirt, once a respectable cotton, was torn at the shoulder, a grimy flag of surrender. Dust clung to the damp patches of sweat on her back and filmed her face, catching in the desperate lines around her mouth. She breathed in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a painful scrape in her throat, as if she were swallowing the grit-laced air itself. And she kept looking back. Her head would whip around, her eyes wide and scanning the long, empty ribbon of the wagon road that snaked its way toward the horizon. A trail of shimmering heat and nothingness. But she saw something there, or feared she would. On the porch of the small, unpainted ranch house that stood defiant against the vast emptiness, Sawyer Doone saw her. He was a man carved from the same hard landscape, his face a map of sun-creased lines, his shoulders broad and stooped just enough to suggest a lifetime of heavy work. The morning was his quiet time, a ritual of coffee and contemplation before the day's labors began in earnest. The tin cup was halfway to his lips when the woman pitched forward, catching herself on a fence post. The cup slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the wooden planks of the porch, its dark contents spreading like a stain. She fell to her knees, her body finally giving out. Yet, even then, her will fought on. She twisted her head, her gaze still locked on that empty road. A sound, barely a whisper, was torn from her lungs, carried on the dry wind to his ears. "Get inside first, then—" The words were a plea, an instruction, a desperate fragment that sliced through the morning's peace. For a moment, Sawyer remained frozen, a silhouette against the dark interior of his home. Then he moved. There was no hesitation, only a sudden, coiled economy of motion. He was off the porch in 3 long strides, his worn leather boots kicking up puffs of red dust. He reached her as she swayed, her strength gone. He saw the marks on her wrists, raw and red where a rope had chafed her skin raw. Her eyes, when they met his, were a maelstrom of fear and exhaustion. He didn't ask a question. Questions were a luxury, and there was no time. He shrugged off the heavy, fleece-lined coat he wore against the morning chill, its warmth a stark contrast to the day's coming heat, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The wool was rough, smelling faintly of leather and wood smoke, a scent of solid, simple things. From a sheath on his belt, he drew a small, sharp knife. With 2 quick, precise movements, he sliced through the frayed remnants of a rope still looped around one of her wrists. It fell away into the dust. Then, hooking one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her across the yard and up the 2 steps to the porch, his boots making a heavy, purposeful sound on the wood. He nudged the door open with his shoulder, stepped into the cool dimness of the house, and let the door swing shut behind them. The latch fell with a solid, definitive click. Sawyer didn't stop. He crossed the main room and gently set her down in a sturdy wooden chair by the hearth. Then he turned back to the door, took off his own dusty boots, and placed them deliberately on the floor, wedged against the bottom of the door. It wasn't a lock, but it was a barrier, a statement, a silent, immediate vow. He turned back to her. She was huddled in the chair, clutching his coat around her as if it were armor. Her breathing was still ragged, but the panicked edge was gone, replaced by deep, shuddering tremors. He moved to the dry sink, pumped some water into a clean tin cup, and brought it to her. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold it steady. He knelt, holding the cup to her lips so she could drink. She took small, thirsty sips, the water seeming to bring a flicker of life back into her eyes. When the cup was empty, she finally spoke again. Her voice was hoarse, cracked with dust and disuse, but there was a core of strength in it, a refusal to be completely broken. "My name," she said, her gaze fixed on his, "is Lydia Pike." She took another shaky breath, the words coming out in a rush. "I didn't choose that marriage. I was given to settle a debt." The words hung in the quiet room, stark and ugly. They painted a picture of a smoky saloon, of greasy cards and the clink of coins, of a life gambled away by another. Before Sawyer could process it, another sound reached them from outside, faint but unmistakable. It was the rhythmic crunch and groan of heavy wagon wheels turning on the dry road. Drawing nearer, a plume of dust, visible through the single window, rose against the blue sky. The threat she had been running from was no longer a ghost on the horizon. It was arriving. Lydia's head snapped toward the window, the terror returning to her eyes. Sawyer stood up, his large frame a solid presence between her and the door. He placed the empty cup on the rough-hewn table, the small metallic sound echoing in the tense silence. He looked from her terrified face to the approaching dust cloud, and his expression hardened into one of grim resolve. He spoke, his voice low and steady. Not a shout, but a promise forged in iron. "You're safe here." The wagon wheels had long since faded into silence, but the dust they had raised still hung in the air, a golden haze in the afternoon sun. Inside the small house, the silence was different. It was a taut, listening quiet. Then, a new sound began. Distinct from the groan of the windmill, the rhythmic, determined beat of a single horse's hooves striking the hard-packed earth. The sound grew steadily louder, each footfall a hammer blow against the fragile peace. Lydia, still huddled in the chair, flinched. Sawyer, who had been standing by the window, turned his head. He didn't need to see the rider to know who it was. The arrogance was in the very rhythm of the horse's gait. A heavy-set man on a tired-looking bay reined in at the broken gate. He was thick in the shoulders and neck, with a face flushed from drink and sun. A greasy beard, stained with what looked like tobacco, covered his jaw. The man swung himself out of the saddle, his movements sloppy but aggressive. The smell of him seemed to precede him, a foul miasma of cheap whiskey and stale sweat that even the hot wind couldn't entirely disperse. This was Boar Kincaid. He didn't bother with the gate, simply kicked a loose board aside and stomped into the yard, his spurs jingling a discordant tune. He planted his boots in the dust and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Dune." The voice was a raw, grating sound, like rocks being ground together. "You send my wife out now." He spat the words out, a proclamation of ownership from a man who believed the world was his to claim. That law was a flimsy thing he could bend or break at will. The front door of the ranch house opened. Sawyer stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close quietly behind him. He stood with his hands hanging loose at his sides, well away from the Colt holstered on his hip. He didn't lean against a post or cross his arms. He simply stood, his feet planted, his body a straight, unyielding line. He was the final fence post of his land, the last barrier between the quiet house and the loud, violent man in the yard. "She's not your wife," Sawyer said. His voice was calm, carrying easily in the dry air. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. Kincaid let out a harsh laugh. "The hell she ain't, I won her. Fair and square. Pike's own marker says so. Now send her out before I come in and drag her out." "The lady stays," Sawyer replied, his gaze unwavering. "You'll leave." The pretense of negotiation vanished from Kincaid's face, replaced by a brutish fury. "You got no say in it. Sodbuster, this is between me and my property." He started toward the porch, his hand dropping to the butt of his own pistol. "Take one more step and you'll find out how much say I have," Sawyer said, still not moving a muscle. The stillness was more menacing than any threat. Kincaid stopped, his face contorting. He was a man used to getting his way through noise and intimidation. This quiet refusal infuriated him. With a roar of frustration, he abandoned his gun and lunged up the steps, his big right fist swinging in a wild arc aimed at Sawyer's head. The motion was clumsy, fueled by whiskey and rage. Sawyer moved with a speed that was deceptive in a man his size. He didn't step back, he stepped in. His left hand came up, not to block the punch but to catch Kincaid's wrist, deflecting the blow. At the same time, his right hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of Kincaid's shirt, using the man's own momentum against him. Sawyer pivoted, pulling and twisting in one fluid motion. Kincaid, thrown off balance, tumbled past him, crashing heavily down the steps and landing in a heap in the dust. The pistol holstered on his hip was jarred loose and skittered across the yard. Sawyer stepped off the porch. He walked calmly to the fallen gun, picked it up, and emptied the chambers, letting the cartridges fall into the dirt. He tossed the useless piece of metal toward Kincaid's horse, which shied away with a nervous whinny. Sawyer's eyes never once looked at the man sprawled on the ground. His focus was on the horse, the animal that had brought this trouble to his door. It was as if Kincaid himself was beneath his notice. "This land doesn't trade in people," Sawyer said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "Go back to your cards and your whiskey. There's nothing for you here." Kincaid pushed himself up, his face a mask of humiliation and fury. Dust and spittle clung to his beard. He pointed a trembling finger at the house. "This ain't over. Soon I'll be back with the law. And we'll see who's right then." He scrambled to his feet, snatched up his empty pistol, and stomped back to his horse. Muttering a stream of curses, he hauled himself into the saddle and rode off, a wake of impotent rage and dust trailing behind him. Inside, Lydia had heard everything. She was on her feet, her body trembling so violently the floorboards seemed to vibrate beneath her. Sawyer came back in, his boots making their solid, reassuring sound. He shut the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt across it. He looked at her, saw the raw fear in her eyes, and his own expression softened almost imperceptibly. He went to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room and lifted the lid. He took out a neatly folded shirt of pale, sun-faded cotton. It was worn soft with washing, but clean and whole. He walked over and gently placed it in her hands. "Yours," he said. His voice was low. "For her alone. No one touches you while I'm breathing." That night was a long one. The wind picked up, making the old windmill creak and groan on a relentless, repeating cycle. To Lydia, it sounded like it was counting the hours, or perhaps counting the threats that lay waiting in the darkness. She lay on a simple cot Sawyer had prepared for her, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket that smelled of dried herbs. Sleep came only in short, broken bursts, filled with fragmented images of her stepfather's greedy eyes and the leering face of Boar Kincaid. But through the fear, another scent anchored her to the present, the clean, dry smell of the pine walls and a hint of mint from a small plant Sawyer kept on the windowsill. It was the scent of a safe harbor. When dawn broke, pale and gray, Sawyer was already up. He moved with a quiet efficiency, stoking the fire in the hearth. He saw that she was awake, her eyes wide in the dim light. He didn't press her with questions. Instead, he took a clean strip of cloth and a small tin of salve and showed her, his large hands surprisingly gentle, how to properly dress and bandage the raw rope burns on her wrists. He boiled water in a kettle over the fire and poured some into a basin for her to wash the grime from her face and the scrapes on her arms. His words were few, functional and direct. but they were as solid and dependable as the nails holding the roof together. The morning passed in a haze of slow, deliberate work. The tension of the previous day had not vanished, but it had settled, replaced by a watchful quiet. Around midday, the watchfulness was justified. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, dark specks against the blinding glare of the sun. As they drew closer, Lydia's heart sank. One was Boar Kincaid, sitting straighter in his saddle today, a smug look on his face. The other man was lean and weathered, wearing a dusty duster and a tin star pinned to his vest. Sawyer had seen them too. He stepped out onto the porch, waiting. Lydia watched from the window, her hands clenched into fists. Kincaid reined in, pointing a triumphant finger at the house. The marshal dismounted, his movements weary but methodical. He walked toward the porch, his eyes taking in everything. "Sawyer," the marshal said, his voice dry as the dust on his boots. "Ellis," Sawyer replied. And in that single word, a silent history passed between them. A memory flickered in Sawyer's mind, the flash of cannon fire on a distant border campaign. The taste of alkali dust and the shared weight of dragging a wounded comrade Ellis Rourke to safety through a storm of bullets. They had saved each other's lives once, a long time ago. "Kincaid here has lodged a complaint," Rourke said. "Getting straight to the point, says you're holding his wife against her will." "She's not his wife," Sawyer stated again, his tone unchanged. Rourke's gaze shifted past Sawyer to the window where Lydia stood. "Ma'am, can you step out here, please?" Lydia's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, pulling Sawyer's old coat tighter around her. The marshal's eyes were not unkind, but they were searching, professional. "This man claims you're married to him," Rourke said, nodding toward Kincaid. "Is there a marriage certificate?" "A preacher's signature." Lydia lifted her chin. The tremor was still in her voice, but the resolve was there too. "No," she said clearly. "There is nothing. My stepfather gave me to him to settle a gambling marker. I was forced—" Rourke listened, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on Kincaid, who was beginning to look less smug. "Kincaid," the marshal said, his voice taking on a hard, official edge. "You're new to these parts, so I'll tell you how things are. We have laws in Silver Butte County, and under our laws, gambling debts are not settled with people. A man's daughter is not a horse to be traded. You have no claim here." Kincaid's face turned a mottled purple. "That's not right. I have a marker." "Your marker is a piece of paper between you and Alton Pike," Rourke said dismissively. "It has nothing to do with this woman. Now, I suggest you ride out. My business here is concluded." Defeated and furious, Kincaid could only glare. He spat a string of vile threats, promising that this wasn't the end of it, before wrenching his horse's head around and galloping away, his humiliation a cloud of dust behind him. Marshal Rourke watched him go, then turned back to Sawyer. The official hardness left his face, replaced by the weary concern of an old acquaintance. "He'll be back, Sawyer," he warned, his voice low. "A man like that, with his pride stung, he doesn't just let go, and he won't come back alone next time." Sawyer nodded, his eyes on the road where Kincaid had disappeared. "I know." The marshal mounted his horse, gave a final, troubled look at the small ranch house, and rode away, leaving Sawyer and Lydia alone once more in the vast, dangerous silence of the West. The immediate threat was gone, but a larger one was just beginning to gather. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. It was a language Lydia did not know, but she was a desperate and determined student. Sawyer started her with the horses. He showed her how to muck out the stalls. The sharp, earthy smell of hay and animal sweat a shock to her senses. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and kitchen chores, were soft and clumsy with the heavy pitchfork. By the end of the first day, angry red blisters had risen on her palms, She looked at them not with dismay, but with a strange sense of accomplishment. The physical sting was real, immediate, and it crowded out the formless, lingering ache of fear in her mind. Sawyer was a man of few words, but his instruction was clear. He showed her how to tie a slip knot that could be released with a single tug, and then a sturdy highwayman's hitch for securing a horse to a post. "A good knot is an honest thing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It does its job, no more, no less." His eyes, when he looked at her, were no longer just watchful. They held a flicker of approval. The panic that had lived in her chest for so long began to recede, not gone, but quieted by the steady demands of work. Her world, which had been a chaotic storm of terror, was shrinking to the manageable size of the dry lantern ranch, the stable, the well, the porch, the horizon. That evening, they sat at the small wooden table in the main room, the air filled with the scent of simmering beans and baking cornbread. Sawyer had placed a slab of the golden bread and a ladleful of thick, dark stew onto a plate for her, for the first time since she'd arrived. Lydia picked up her fork and took a bite without her hand trembling. The food was simple, hearty, and tasted of the earth. It was the most profound comfort she had known in months. As she ate, a memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. It wasn't a dream this time, but a stark, waking vision. The painted gourd saloon, the air thick with cigar smoke and the cloying sweetness of spilled whiskey. The frantic, desperate click of the faro case as the dealer slid the cards out. And her stepfather, Alton Pike, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting between his dwindling pile of chips and the impassive face of Boar Kincaid. She remembered the final hand, the collective sigh from the onlookers, and Alton's slumped shoulders. Then came the chilling words from Kincaid, his voice thick with triumph. "Well, Pike, looks like you're fresh out of cash, but you still got one thing of value." And Alton Pike, a man hollowed out by his addiction to chance, had not even looked at her as he nodded his assent. He had traded her life for one more hand, one more chance to lose. The shame of it washed over her, a hot, sickening wave. To be a marker, a debt, less than a horse, less than a sack of flour. A knot tightened in her stomach, and she put her fork down. Sawyer noticed. He had been eating with a slow, steady focus, but he was aware of everything in the small room. He saw the light drain from her face, the way her shoulders curved inward as if to shield herself. But he didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he simply pushed the small bowl of wild honey closer to her side of the table. "Good on the bread," he said quietly, and then went back to his meal. His silence was a gift. It was a sturdy wall she could lean against, a space where she didn't have to explain or relive the horror. It was a profound and unspoken act of respect. A few days later, Marshal Rourke rode out again. He dismounted and accepted a cup of water from the well, his face etched with professional concern. "Just wanted to let you know, Sawyer," he said, getting straight to it. "I had a word with the circuit judge over in Silver Butte. He says Kincaid has no legal standing based on a gambling marker, but—" he paused, swirling the water in his cup. "He also said a man like Kincaid is slippery. If he were to show up with a forged marriage certificate, signed by some disreputable preacher from another territory, well, it would muddy the waters considerably. It would become her word against a signed document, and in these parts, a document often carries more weight." The warning hung in the hot afternoon air long after the marshal had ridden away. A piece of paper could undo everything. A lie, written in ink, could drag her back into the nightmare. That afternoon, Sawyer began to repair the broken gate where Lydia had first stumbled onto his property. He worked with a patient strength, setting a new post deep into the hard earth. After a while, Lydia came out of the house. She watched him for a few moments, then walked over and picked up the heavy hammer. She didn't ask. She simply took a handful of nails from the leather pouch at his side and began to secure the wooden slats to the new frame. Sawyer straightened up, watched her for a beat, and then went back to his own work, holding the board steady for her. The only sound between them was the rhythmic, solid report of the hammer striking the nails. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was a steady, life-affirming sound, like a heartbeat slowly finding its proper rhythm again. She was no longer just a refugee. She was helping to mend the broken entrance to her sanctuary. As they finished, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep copper. A stillness fell over the land. In the distance, a small herd of pronghorn antelope moved like ghosts across the plains, their white rumps flashing as they crossed the dry bed of Sable Creek. Sawyer and Lydia stood together, two silent figures watching the day die. It was a moment of shared, unspoken peace, a fragile truce with the harsh beauty of the land. Word, like dust, travels fast on the frontier. In the small, dusty town of Mesquite Vale, a few miles down the creek, the whispers had already begun. "Did you hear about Sawyer Doone? The widower got some strange girl staying out at his place." The gossip was a mix of suspicion and curiosity, a natural reaction to anything that upset the predictable patterns of their lives. Lydia needed supplies. She had nothing but the torn clothes she'd arrived in. Sawyer gave her a small pouch of coins and the reins to his gentlest mare. In town, she kept her head down, acutely aware of the curious glances that followed her. She went into the general store, a building that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. Behind the counter stood a woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that saw everything but judged little. This was Nora Finch. Lydia made her purchases: flour, salt, a length of simple cotton cloth. As she was about to pay, Nora looked down at Lydia's worn-out shoes, which were barely holding together. Without a word, Mrs. Finch went into the back room and returned with a pair of sturdy, second-hand leather boots. They were scuffed but solid. "A boy outgrew them," she said simply. "You look like you do a lot of walking. These will last." Then her eyes fell on the small pat of fresh butter Lydia had churned that morning and brought, wrapped in cheesecloth, as a hopeful offering. "I'll trade you the boots for that butter," Nora said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Good butter is hard to come by." It wasn't charity, it was a fair trade, an acknowledgement of Lydia's worth and work. It was an act of quiet welcome. That night, after Lydia had gone to her cot, Sawyer sat at the table by the light of a single oil lamp. He took out a piece of paper, a pen, and a small bottle of ink. He wrote slowly, his large, calloused hands forming the letters with care. It was a short letter, addressed to a traveling preacher he knew, a man named Bram Eddins, who made a circuit through the territory every few months. He asked the preacher to make a stop at the Dry Lantern Ranch on his next journey. He didn't tell Lydia what he had done, or why. The reason was a seed he had planted, one he needed to tend in silence for now. The fire in the hearth crackled, spitting sparks against the stone. From the other side of the room, Sawyer could hear Lydia humming softly to herself. It was a simple, haunting melody, a tune she hadn't realized she remembered until it came unbidden to her lips. It was a song her mother used to sing to her, long ago, before her father died, before Alton Pike came into their lives and gambled away their future. Sawyer stood up and walked to the front door. He opened it and looked out into the vast, star-dusted darkness. The windmill creaked its lonely song. He took a small can of axle grease and carefully, quietly, rubbed it onto the door's iron hinges. The next time he closed it, it swung shut without a sound. It was a small thing, an effort to make the night a little less filled with jarring sounds, a little more peaceful. A fragile trust was beginning to sprout in the hard-packed soil of the Dry Lantern Ranch. It was a belief not in miracles or grand rescues, but in the quiet power of the ordinary, a solid meal, a mended gate, a quiet tune, a door that closed without a sound. On the unforgiving frontier, these were the things that mattered most. These were the things that could, piece by piece, rebuild a life. The dawn was a fragile thing, a pale lavender wash that pushed back the deep, star-strewn black of the night. In the corral, Sawyer stood holding the reins of a gentle, dapple-gray mare named Mika. Her eyes were large and dark, and she blew a soft, warm breath onto Lydia's outstretched hand. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, prickled at the back of Lydia's neck. She had been on a horse before, but always as a passenger, never as a master of her own direction. "She'll hold you," Sawyer said, his voice a low reassurance in the quiet morning. "Just need to trust her, and trust yourself." He showed her how to mount, his hands firm and steady at her waist as he helped her settle into the worn leather saddle. At first, it felt impossibly high, a precarious perch from which to fall. She was clumsy, her movement stiff and uncertain. Mika, sensing her tension, shifted restlessly beneath her. Lydia gripped the reins so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sawyer walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on the mare's neck, speaking in a low, calming murmur to both horse and rider. They made a slow circle of the corral, then another, gradually. Lydia began to feel the rhythm of the horse's walk, the powerful, rolling motion of its muscles. She loosened her death grip on the reins, allowing her body to sway with the movement instead of fighting it. Sawyer stepped back, letting her guide the mare on her own. She urged Mika into a slow trot, a jarring, bumpy gait that almost unseated her. She let out a small gasp, half fear, half surprise, and then a sound escaped her that was utterly foreign. It was a laugh, not a polite titter, but a genuine, unbidden peal of laughter that bubbled up from deep inside her. The absurdity of her bouncing, flailing form, the simple joy of the morning air, the patience of the mare beneath her, it all combined into a moment of pure, unadulterated release. Sawyer stopped walking, and a slow, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a sound more welcome than rain. In the days that followed, they worked on the new fence line, a long, ambitious stretch that would run along the base of Coyote Spire, a rugged outcrop of red rock that marked the northern edge of the ranch. The work was grueling, the sun was relentless, and the ground was a stubborn mix of rock and baked clay. They worked in a rhythm born of shared purpose, a silent choreography of labor. Sawyer would dig the post holes with a heavy auger, his muscles straining with each turn. Lydia would follow behind, dropping the heavy cedar posts into the holes and tamping the earth around them until they stood firm and true. Then came the wire, sharp and unforgiving, which they stretched taut between the posts. They spoke little. The work was too hard, the air too hot for wasted breath, but a different kind of communication flowed between them, a shared glance when a particularly stubborn rock was dislodged. The simple gesture of him passing her the water canteen without being asked, the way she learned to anticipate which tool he would need next, having it ready for him. Sweat and dust became the ink of their silent contract. They were partners in this endeavor, taming a small piece of the wild land together. They were building a barrier, a clear line between what was safe and what was not, and the act of its creation was a powerful bond. The change was not just in the land, but in the small house as well. One evening, Lydia was stirring a pot of beans over the fire. On a whim, she found a small tin of herbs Sawyer kept on a high shelf and added a pinch of wild dill to the pot. A moment later, Sawyer came in from the stable, stamping the dust from his boots. He stopped just inside the door and sniffed the air. A strange, arrested look came over his face. "Smells like home," he said, the words quiet, almost to himself. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask, but she understood. He was speaking of a time before, a life with his late wife, a warmth that had long since vanished from this house. Her simple act of adding an herb had inadvertently opened a door to his past, and in doing so, had made her more a part of his present. A week later, the sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue for weeks, turned a bruised purple. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, and soon a sudden, violent downpour swept across the ranch. It was not a gentle shower, but a deluge that hammered against the roof and turned the dusty yard to a sea of red mud. Inside, a persistent drip began near the hearth, a leak in the roof. "It's been a while," Sawyer muttered. Grabbing a bucket, they worked quickly, moving sacks of flour and sugar away from the spreading puddle. Sawyer climbed onto a chair, pushing at the ceiling boards to locate the source. "Need to patch it from the inside for now. Hand me that plank." Lydia picked up a short, flat piece of wood. She climbed onto a stool beside him to hand it up. The space was cramped. As he reached to take the plank, his hand covered hers, pressing it against the rough wood. It was an accidental, functional touch, but it lingered. His hand was large, the skin calloused and warm. Hers was smaller, still soft despite the new blisters. For a long second, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof, a distant roar. He could have let go. She could have pulled her hand away. Neither did. Then, as slowly as it had happened, he took the plank from her, his fingers brushing against hers one last time, and turned his attention back to the roof. The moment passed, unacknowledged, but it left an invisible current of awareness humming in the air between them. On her next trip to Mesquite Vale, Lydia noticed a change. The stairs were still there, but they were different, less suspicious, more curious. In Nora Finch's store, a woman she didn't know nodded and smiled at her. The whispers that reached her ears were no longer about the strange girl. Instead, she heard one woman say to another, "That's the one staying with Dune. Nora says she makes a fine butter. Heard her laughing the other day. Clear as a bell." She was no longer just a mystery. She was becoming a person in their eyes, a woman who worked, who made things, who could laugh. She had seen how Sawyer's hair, which he kept long, would fall into his eyes when he was bent over his work. Sawing wood or repairing a harness, he was constantly pushing it back with a dusty hand. One evening, using scraps of leather she'd saved, Lydia sat by the fire and carefully braided a thin, strong thong. It was a simple, practical thing. The next morning, as he headed out to the woodpile, she held it out to him. "For your hair," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. He stopped, looking at the braided leather in her hand, then at her. He took it without a word, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He gathered his dark hair and tied it back at the nape of his neck. The simple gift was an act of observation, of care. It was another thread woven into the growing tapestry of their shared life. That night, as if in reciprocation, he did something unexpected. After their meal, he went to the large wooden chest that held his late wife's belongings and pulled out an old parlor guitar. Its wood was dark and scarred, its strings tarnished. He sat down and, with a surprising delicacy, began to tune it. He didn't play a song, just a few simple chords that filled the quiet room with a melancholic warmth. He nodded toward the instrument. She used to play. Lydia watched him, her heart aching for the story held in those few words. After a moment of silence, she began to hum, the same tune her mother had sung to her. And then, softly, she began to sing the words. It was an old river ballad, Shenandoah, a song of farewells and far-off lands. Her voice was quiet, a little rusty, but clear and true. She sang it not as a song of the wide Missouri, but with a slower, more deliberate cadence, as if the river in the song were as slow and patient and thirsty as Sable Creek. It was a song of her past, reshaped by her present. They began to talk, not in long, soul-bearing confessions, but in small, hesitant pieces. She told him about her mother's love for music. He told her about building the ranch house with his own hands. They learned to speak of their pasts not as open wounds to be constantly probed, but as landscapes they had traveled through to get to this place. They were learning to carry their histories without letting them become their entire identity. The fragile peace was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats 2 days later. It was Marshall Rourke, and the urgency in his face told them this was not a social call. "Sawyer, Lydia," he said, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "I have bad news. Kincaid isn't just making threats anymore. He's been in the saloons over at Silver Butte, flashing money around. He's hired himself 2 men, gunslingers, a man named Dill Ransom and another called Hoke Bell. They're not just farmhands looking for trouble. They're professionals." A cold dread settled over Lydia. The threat was no longer a single, drunken brute. It now had names, and it had numbers. Sawyer stood motionless, his face hardening into a grim mask. He stared out at the horizon as if he could see the danger riding toward them. He was silent for a long time. The only sounds the nervous stamp of Rourke's horse and the ever-present groan of the windmill. When he finally spoke, he looked directly at Lydia. "There's one way to stop him for good," he said, his voice low and even. "One way to make any claim he tries to make, any paper he tries to forge, worthless under the law." He took a breath. "We get married." The words dropped into the silence, heavy and shocking. Lydia stared at him, unable to process what he had said. A marriage? To this quiet, solitary man? It was unthinkable. He saw the confusion and fear in her eyes and quickly held up a hand. "In name only," he clarified, his tone practical, strategic, a marriage of convenience. "He can't claim you as his wife if you're already married to me. A legal document, filed with the county, witnessed by the preacher I've already sent for. It would be a shield. Lydia, a legal wall he can't break down." Lydia turned away. Walking to the edge of the porch, she wrapped her arms around herself, her gaze unfocused. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She thought of the shame, the fear, the feeling of being property. Now this man was offering her his name, his protection, in the most binding way possible. The oil lamp inside the house had just been lit, and its flickering flame was reflected in her wide, troubled eyes. She finally turned back to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Can a name on a paper erase a nightmare?" It was the heart of the matter, a legal solution for an emotional wound. Sawyer's expression was somber, his gaze direct and unflinchingly honest. "No," he answered, his voice gentle but firm. "It can't, but it bolts the door before the storm hits." The simple, powerful truth of his words resonated within her. It wasn't a promise of happiness or an end to her memories. It was a practical, powerful tool for survival. It was a lock for the door. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her mind made up. "All right," she said, her voice gaining strength, "but on one condition. This is for safety, a partnership to keep me free. There are no other promises. No, emotional expectations." She had to say it, had to draw the line clearly. Sawyer looked at her, his eyes holding a deep, unwavering respect. He simply nodded. "That's the foundation it will be built on." He agreed, and in that moment, they struck a bargain. Not of love, but of mutual survival. A pact made under the vast and unforgiving sky of the West. The preacher arrived on a morning when the wind had a sharp, dry edge to it, scouring the plains and sending dust devils dancing across the flats. He was a thin, stooped man named Bram Eddins, with a face as weathered as an old Bible and eyes that held the weary patience of a man who had seen too much of the human soul. He rode a mule that seemed as tired as he was. Marshal Ellis Rourke arrived shortly after, his presence a solid, official counterpoint to the preacher's quiet piety. And then, from the direction of town, came Nora Finch's buckboard. The formidable store owner climbed down, carrying a freshly baked apple pie. Its warm, cinnamon scent was a fragrant offering of peace, a domestic flag planted in the midst of a looming war. She didn't say much, simply placed the pie on the porch railing and nodded. "Every official occasion needs a bit of sweetness," was all she offered. But her presence spoke volumes. She was taking a side. The ceremony was conducted on the front porch, with the vast, indifferent landscape as their cathedral and the moaning windmill as their choir. There were no flowers, no fine clothes. Lydia wore the simple cotton dress she had bought in town, and Sawyer wore a clean work shirt. Reverend Eden's words were not flowery or poetic. They were the simple, sturdy words of the frontier. Speaking of partnership, shelter, and mutual aid in the face of hardship, they were words meant to build a foundation, not a fantasy. When the time came, Rourke produced a document from his saddlebag, the Silver Butte County Marriage Ledger. Sawyer signed his name first, his script a strong, unadorned scrawl. Then the pen was passed to Lydia. She held it for a moment, the tip hovering over the paper. This was it, the lock for the door. She looked at Sawyer, whose face was unreadable, but whose eyes met hers with a steady, reassuring calm. She signed her name, Lydia Pike, for the last time. Beneath it, the preacher added his signature, and Rourke affixed his own as the official witness. He then took out a small, heavy metal press from his bag and an ink pad. He pressed the seal firmly onto the paper, leaving the embossed emblem of Silver Butte County. It was done. A dry, practical transaction that nonetheless changed everything. The word husband and wife hung between them, unspoken but now legally binding, as solid and real as the wood of the porch beneath their feet. Nora Finch cut the pie. They were standing there, a strange and solemn little gathering, when the sound of multiple riders approaching at a gallop broke the quiet. Sawyer immediately stepped in front of Lydia. Rourke's hand moved instinctively to rest on the butt of his pistol. Boer Kincaid and his two new associates, Dill Ransom and Hoke Bell, reined in their horses in a spray of dirt and gravel just outside the mended gate. Kincaid's face was a mask of smug triumph. He was a man who believed he had arrived to claim his property, and he had brought the muscle to enforce the collection. "We're here for my wife," Dune Kincaid bellowed, swinging down from his horse. "And this time, the law is on my side." He strode toward the porch, his hired men fanning out behind him like vultures. He stopped short when he saw the preacher and the marshal. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by belligerence. "What's all this?" he sneered. Marshal Rourke took a slow, deliberate bite of apple pie before answering. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and held up the marriage ledger, his thumb pointing to the fresh ink and the official seal. "You're about 30 minutes too late." "Kincaid," Rourke said, his voice flat. "According to this legally executed and witnessed document, the lady is Mrs. Sawyer Dune." Kincaid stared at the paper, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "That's a trick! That paper's worthless void," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. Rourke didn't raise his voice. He simply held the ledger so the official seal caught the morning light. "This is the seal of Silver Butte County. It's registered. It's legal. You have no business here. Now, I believe the polite thing to do would be for you to get on your horse and ride." The two hired guns looked at each other, then at the marshal's calm, confident demeanor. They were paid to intimidate ranchers, not to directly confront an officer of the law holding an official document. Kincaid, sputtering with a rage that had no outlet, saw his authority evaporate. He shot a look of pure venom at Lydia, then at Sawyer. He spun on his heel, stomped back to his horse, and mounted. "This ain't over," he screamed, his voice a raw promise of retribution. Then he and his men galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust to settle in their wake. But Kincaid was not a man to accept defeat. His rage simply curdled into cunning. That very afternoon, he rode back to the one place he felt truly in command, the Painted Gourd Saloon. There, amidst the smell of stale beer and desperation, he sought out a man known for his flexible interpretation of the law, a disgraced lawyer named Bramholt, whose office was a corner table in the saloon, for the price of a bottle of whiskey and a handful of silver dollars. Bramholt agreed to draft a false affidavit, a sworn statement claiming that he, Bramholt, had personally witnessed a marriage ceremony between Kincaid and Lydia Pike months earlier in a different territory. The next step was to give this fabrication the appearance of truth. Kincaid's target was a man named Yancey, a junior clerk at the county courthouse. Yancey was a man with weak nerves and a strong taste for gambling, a combination Kincaid knew how to exploit. He cornered the clerk that evening, reminding him of his outstanding debts, and then made him an offer, a stack of coins to clear his slate in exchange for one small, discreet act. All Yancey had to do was gain access to the county seal for a few moments and backdate its impression on Bramholt's forged marriage certificate. Yancey, sweating and terrified, agreed. The trap was being set. Kincaid would not challenge Sawyer's document. He would simply produce one that predated it, making Sawyer's marriage legally void. That night, the wind rose again, a mournful, restless sound that clawed at the corners of the small ranch house. It kicked up the dust, creating a shifting, opaque curtain around the isolated homestead. It was a perfect cover for furtive movement. Inside, Lydia was trying to mend a shirt by the light of the oil lamp, but she couldn't concentrate. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every creak of the house sounded like a threat. Suddenly, she froze, her needle poised in midair. She held her breath, listening. It was not the wind. It was a distinct, metallic sound from the direction of the stable, the faint, careful scrape of metal on metal, the sound of a lock being picked. Her eyes darted to Sawyer, who was cleaning a rifle at the table. He had heard it too. He had gone utterly still, his head cocked, his body as tense as a coiled spring. Without a word, he reached over and turned down the wick of the oil lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. Only the faint, flickering glow from the hearth remained. They sat in the thick, suffocating silence, two stone figures in the dark, listening. The scraping sound stopped. It was followed by the soft, heavy thud of the stable door swinging open. They waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then came a sharp, violent thwump from directly outside. It was the sound of a knife blade sinking deep into wood. Sawyer was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands. He moved to the door, listening for any sign of retreat, hearing nothing but the wind. He slowly, carefully lifted the bolt and pulled the door open a crack. There, embedded to the hilt in the thick wood of a porch post, was a large Bowie knife. Pinned by the blade was a small, folded piece of paper. Sawyer scanned the darkness, then quickly pulled the knife free and shut and bolted the door. He brought the note to the faint firelight. He unfolded it and read the words, which had been crudely scrawled in charcoal. A borrowed marriage. The next morning, Sawyer rode into town and went directly to the marshal's office. Rourke listened to the story, his face grim. He agreed to organize a nightly patrol, recruiting a few trusted townsfolk to ride the perimeter of the ranches on the edge of town, including the dry lantern, but they both knew it was a temporary measure. A patrol couldn't be everywhere at once. So, when Sawyer returned, he brought with him spools of thin wire and a sack of small brass bells. He and Lydia spent the rest of the day stringing an intricate, low-slung web around the house and stables, a crude but effective alarm system. Any intruder in the night would announce their presence with a sudden, jarring jingle. Lydia knew that legal documents and bell wires were not enough. Kincaid was fighting a war of paper and intimidation, and she needed a more powerful weapon. Her mind went to Judge Merrow, an influential man in the neighboring county of Copper Trace. Years ago, the judge's young son had taken a bad fall from a horse near her old home. Lydia had been the one to find him, setting his broken leg with practiced skills she'd learned from her mother and staying with him until help arrived. The judge had been profoundly grateful. She spent that evening carefully composing a letter. She explained her situation clearly and concisely, not as a plea for pity, but as a request for legal counsel. She described the forced betrothal, Kincaid's harassment, and Sawyer's protective, in-name-only marriage. She was appealing not just to his sense of gratitude, but to his position as a pillar of the law. The reply came back faster than she had dared to hope, carried by the mail coach a week later. It was a single sheet of paper with the official letterhead of the Copper Trace Judiciary. The message was brief and to the point. A coerced contract is no contract at all. The judge had written, "The issue is not his false document versus yours. The issue is the original crime. If you can provide evidence that you were treated as chattel, as property to be traded for a gambling debt, then Mr. Kincaid is not a wronged husband. He is a criminal guilty of a most serious offense. The burden of proof would fall upon you, but the weight of the law would fall upon him." The judge's words were like a lantern lit in a dark room. He had given her a new direction, a new strategy. She wasn't just defending her marriage to Sawyer. She had to attack the very foundation of Kincaid's claim. She had to prove she was never his to begin with. That night, Lydia took out a small, blank ledger she had bought from Nora Finch's store. She lit a candle and began to write. She dredged up every painful detail she could from her time at the Painted Gourd Saloon. She wrote down the names of the other gamblers she remembered seeing at the faro table on the night she was traded away. She listed the approximate times, the flow of the game, the names of the men Alton Pike owed money to. She chronicled every threat Kincaid had made, and then she remembered something else, a small detail, a gambler's tick. Kincaid dealt the cards with his right hand, but when he was bluffing, when he was trying to intimidate another player, he had a habit of tapping his left index finger on the table, a quick, almost imperceptible nervous gesture. It was a sign of his deception. She wrote that down. 2. The ledger was no longer just a book of accounts. It was becoming a weapon. She was no longer just a victim. She was building her case. The attack came on the night of the dust storm. It was not a normal wind. It was a physical assault, a howling, malevolent force that scoured the land with a billion tiny blades of sand and grit. The air was thick and brown, tasting of dirt and distance. Visibility was reduced to a few feet, and the sun had been blotted from the sky long before it set. Inside the small house, the world had shrunk to the warm circle of light cast by the oil lamp. Every gust of wind that slammed against the walls was like the fist of a giant, rattling the window panes and sending fine veils of dust puffing from beneath the door. Sawyer was reinforcing the latch on the stable door, a task he'd put off for too long. Lydia was inside, securing the shutters. When the sound came, it was not the howl of the wind or the groan of the house. It was a sharp, frantic, and utterly alien sound in the roaring chaos of the storm, the high-pitched, discordant jingle of the brass bells on their tripwire. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound. Then, Sawyer burst through the front door, his face a hard mask of grim certainty, a heavy-limbed shadow moving with astonishing speed. He didn't shout a warning. There was no need. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth as he lunged back out into the maelstrom. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the stinging dust. Lydia's blood ran cold. She ran to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. In the swirling gloom, she could make out two figures near the stable. They had been crouched near the wall, a lit lantern and a can of oil in their hands. They were Dill Ransom and Hoke Bell. The Bells had caught them by surprise. Sawyer was on them before they could draw their weapons. He moved not like a farmer, but like a predator, using the storm's cover to his advantage. He swung the heavy poker in a vicious arc, catching Hoke Bell across the back of the knees. The man howled in pain and collapsed. Dill Ransom, quicker on his feet, abandoned the lantern and lunged at Sawyer, a long knife flashing in his hand. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight, a whirlwind of flailing limbs and guttural grunts half swallowed by the wind. They were 2 against 1, and despite his strength, Sawyer was being forced back toward the house. Lydia's mind, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly kicked into action. She was not a helpless victim in a cage anymore. This was her home they were attacking. Her life. She saw Hoke Bell struggling to his feet, pulling a pistol from his belt. There was no time to think. She acted. She grabbed a heavy burlap sack half filled with feed grain that was propped against the wall. It was immensely heavy, but adrenaline gave her strength. With a desperate cry, she wrenched the front door open just as Hoke was leveling his pistol. She heaved the sack with all her might. It caught him square in the chest, the impact knocking the air from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward off the porch, his shot going wild into the roaring darkness. Sawyer used the distraction. He slammed his elbow into Ransom's face, then drove his fist into the man's gut. Ransom doubled over, gasping, but Hoke was recovering, scrambling in the mud, trying to aim his pistol again. Lydia looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on a stout piece of cedar, a leftover fence post. Leaning against the porch railing, she grabbed it. It was heavy, unwieldy, but solid. As Hoke raised his gun, she swung it like a club, putting all of her fear and fury into the blow. The wood connected with his shoulder with a sickening crunch. The gun flew from his grasp, and he fell to the ground, groaning. Suddenly, another shape emerged from the storm. A rider on a powerful horse. It was Marshal Rourke, his face wrapped in a bandana. His gun already drawn. He must have been on patrol when he saw the lantern light and heard the commotion. "Drop it," his voice boomed over the wind. Dill Ransom, seeing the marshal and his partner incapacitated, made his choice. He shoved Sawyer hard and sprinted away from the light, vanishing into the blinding, swirling dust like a phantom. Rourke didn't fire. A shot into the brownout was too risky. He dismounted quickly, his attention on the man Lydia had struck, with practiced efficiency. He disarmed Hoke, kicked the knife away from Sawyer's feet, and had the man's hands bound behind his back before he could even mount a protest. The immediate violence was over. The roar of the wind seemed to rush back in to fill the silence. Lydia stood on the porch, still clutching the heavy fence post, her knuckles white. Her whole body began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shuddering as the adrenaline gave way to the profound shock of what had just happened. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Sawyer straightened up, breathing heavily. He looked at the bound man on the ground, at the marshal, and then his eyes found Lydia. He saw the state she was in, the post trembling in her hands, her face pale in the faint light spilling from the doorway. He walked up the steps toward her. Something inside Lydia broke, a dam of terror and exhaustion and a desperate, overwhelming need for safety. She dropped the heavy piece of wood, which fell to the porch with a loud clatter. She took one stumbling step forward and threw her arms around him, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt. It wasn't a calculated gesture. It was a desperate, instinctual flight to the only solid, safe thing in her world. She clung to him, the shudders racking her body, and finally let out a choked, tearless sob. For a moment, Sawyer stood rigid with surprise. Then, his arms came around her, pulling her close. He didn't say a word. He didn't pat her back or offer empty reassurances. He simply held her, his large frame a solid, unmoving wall against the raging storm, his warmth a silent shield against the cold fear. He held her until the trembling began to subside, until her ragged breaths started to even out. Rourke, with a tact that belied his rough exterior, finished securing his prisoner and quietly led him and his horse away toward the relative shelter of the stable to wait out the worst of the storm. Inside, the dust storm slowly gave way to a driving rain that lashed against the roof in furious waves. The sound was a steady, rhythmic drumming, washing the world clean. It enclosed them, creating an island of quiet intimacy in the heart of the tempest. Lydia took a clean cloth and a basin of warm water and brought it to the table where Sawyer sat. A thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where Ransom's knife had grazed him. She knelt beside his chair and gently began to clean the wound. Her hand, which had been so steady swinging the fence post, trembled slightly as her fingertips brushed against his skin. She focused on the task, on the small, careful motions, trying to ignore the powerful current of awareness that flowed between them. He sat perfectly still, his eyes watching her face in the warm, flickering lamplight. When she finished, she didn't move away. Her hand lingered for a moment on his temple. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things, with the aftermath of shared violence and the raw, unguarded vulnerability that follows. He slowly raised his hand and covered hers, his calloused thumb gently stroking the back of her wrist, right over the faint, silvery lines of the old rope scars. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The first touch of their lips was soft, hesitant, a question asked in the dark. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. They paused for a half-second, a breath of shared space that was more intimate than the kiss itself. A moment of silent, mutual consent. The rain beat a steady rhythm on the roof above them. Then he kissed her again, a little deeper this time, a slow, searching kiss that spoke of gratitude, of relief, of a feeling that was deeper and more complex than either of them was ready to name. He pulled back just enough so their foreheads were touching. His breath was warm on her face. In the dim light, she could see the storm of emotion in his eyes. "Lydia," he whispered, his voice rough with feeling. "Sawyer," she breathed back, the sound a quiet prayer. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her from her kneeling position into his lap, and held her tightly. It was not the desperate, clinging embrace of the porch. This was different. It was a conscious, deliberate act of holding and being held, a long, silent acknowledgement that the walls between them, the carefully constructed boundaries of their arrangement, had been irrevocably breached. In the warmth of the small kitchen, with the rain washing the world away outside, they had found something real and true in the wreckage of the night. The next morning, the sky was a clean, pale blue, the air washed fresh and cool. They moved around each other with a new, gentle awareness. The physical intimacy of the night before had settled into a quiet, profound tenderness. Over breakfast, Sawyer finally broke the silence. "The paper is one thing," he said, looking down at his coffee cup, then meeting her gaze. "What happened last night? That was something else. Our arrangement still stands. Lydia, the heart, it needs its own time. I won't push you." His words were a gift, a reaffirmation of the respect that had been the bedrock of their relationship from the very beginning. He was giving her space, assuring her that she was still free. The gesture made her feel safer with him than ever before. Later that morning, she went to the small chest where she kept her few belongings. She took out a small object she had been working on in secret. It was a simple charm, fashioned from a flattened piece of silver and attached to a leather thong. She had painstakingly etched it with the image of a single, hopeful sprout pushing its way up through the earth. She found Sawyer by the corral, mending a piece of harness. She held it out to him. "I made this for you," she said softly. He took it, turning the small silver disc over in his palm. "It's to remember," she explained, "that we are replanting a life, both of us." A slow, genuine smile touched his lips. He carefully looped the thong around his neck, tucking the charm inside his shirt. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. Marshal Rourke returned at midday, his face tired but resolute. Hoke Bell wasn't much for loyalty, he said, accepting a cup of water. "He sang like a canary once I got him in a cell. Kincaid's plan is bigger than just harassment. He's going to make his move in 2 days. There's a community hearing in Mesquite Vale to settle a water rights dispute. The whole town will be there. Kincaid plans to interrupt the proceedings. He's going to present his forged, backdated marriage certificate to the town council and Judge Merrow, who's coming in to oversee the hearing. He aims to publicly declare you his wife and demand you be returned to him, using the law to do it." The final confrontation was coming. Lydia felt a chill, but it was followed by a surge of steely resolve. "Then we will be ready for him," she said, her voice clear and strong. She looked at Sawyer, and he nodded in agreement. She turned back to Rourke. "Tell the judge that Kincaid's document is a fraud. I have the names of the men who can prove it, a clerk named Yancey and a lawyer named Bramholt. I have a list of witnesses to the night my stepfather gambled me away. And," she said, holding up her wrist, "where the scars were a permanent testament, I have the proof of the force he used. This was never a marriage. It was a kidnapping." That afternoon, Sawyer began quietly moving some of the best feed and a hidden cask of water into a small, secluded box canyon at the far end of his property. It was a grim, practical task. If the hearing went against them, if the law failed, they would need a place to disappear into for a few days, a place to hide before they could run for good. He was preparing for the worst. But Lydia, empowered by her new resolve, was preparing for the best. She rode into Mesquite Vale, but this time she did not go to the store for supplies. She went to Nora Finch. She explained the situation, Kincaid's plan, and the coming hearing. Nora listened, her expression growing harder and more determined with every word. "That saloon has been a stain on this county for too long," Nora said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Men like Kincaid and Pike think they can treat women like cattle. It's time they learned otherwise." She untied her apron. "You go back to the ranch and prepare your testimony. I will go and have a talk with some of the other women in this town, the ones whose husbands have also lost too much at the Painted Gourd. It's high time some of those saloon whispers were spoken out loud, in the clear light of day." As Lydia rode back to the Dry Lantern Ranch, she felt a new kind of strength. She was not alone. Sawyer was preparing to fight for her, and Nora Finch was rallying an army. The day before the hearing was not a time for waiting. It was a time for war, waged not with guns, but with whispers, strategy, and the slow, deliberate tightening of a legal and moral noose. In the cool of the morning, Sawyer, Lydia, and Marshall Rourke gathered on the porch of the Dry Lantern Ranch. The air was still, the windmill silent, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Rourke laid out their strategy, a three-pronged attack designed to dismantle Kincaid's entire platform of lies. "First," Rourke began, his voice a low, serious rumble, "we need to break his foundation. That means the clerk, Yancey. He's the weak link. I'll pay him a visit this afternoon. Let him know that Hoke Bell is talking, and that an accessory to fraud and coercion faces a long time in a federal prison. We won't threaten him. We'll just present him with the facts. A man like Yancey, his fear will do the work for us. Second, the lawyer, Bramholt. He's a public figure, of a sort. He relies on his reputation, however tarnished. We'll discredit him not in private, but in the full view of the community at the hearing. Nora and her witnesses will be key to that. And third," Rourke's eyes settled on Lydia, "is Kincaid himself. He's arrogant. He believes he's already won. We need to let him walk into his own trap. We let him present his fraudulent paper. We let him make his claims. And then we use his own words, his own pride, to hang him." The first move belonged to Lydia. It was the hardest. She had to return to the place where her life had been bartered away. She rode into Mesquite Vale, Sawyer at her side, and dismounted not at the general store, but in front of the swinging doors of the Painted Gourd Saloon. The smell that wafted out stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap cigars was a physical assault, bringing back a flood of foul memories. She pushed through the doors, her back straight, her eyes scanning the dim, smoky room. There he was, Alton Pike, her stepfather, hunched over a card game in the corner, his shoulders slumped in the familiar posture of a man chasing his losses. He looked up as her shadow fell over his table, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face, which quickly curdled into shock and fear when he saw who it was. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The quiet intensity of her words cut through the low murmur of the saloon. "I came to tell you that the debt is being called due," she said, her voice steady. "Not the one you owe to Mr. Kincaid, the one you owe to me." Alton's face went pale. He started to stammer a denial, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. I don't know what you're talking about, girl." "Don't you?" Lydia's voice was cold as a winter creek. "When you laid down your last marker on that faro table, you laid me down with it. You put a price on my head. Tomorrow, at the hearing, everyone in this county is going to know what that price was." He tried to bluster, to find some scrap of his old authority. "You've got no proof of that." But his words were hollow. His gaze slid away from hers, and that's when he saw him, in a dark corner of the saloon, almost invisible. sat Marshal Rourke, a small notebook open on his knee, a pencil moving steadily across the page, the site of the law, quietly and officially documenting their exchange. Broke Alton Pike. A sheen of sweat popped out on his forehead. He shrank in his chair, suddenly looking old and pathetic, a man trapped by his own weakness. Lydia had said her piece. She turned and walked out, leaving him to stew in the poison of his own making. While Lydia confronted her past, Nora Finch was mobilizing the town's future. She had gathered 2 women in the back room of her store. They were the Perrin sisters, Elspeth and May. 2 stern, silver-haired women who had, for a brief and unprofitable time, run the saloon before selling it. They were respectable, church-going women now, but they had seen the painted gourd's underbelly up close. "You remember the night?" Nora asked them, her voice low and urgent. "The big faro game, the night Alton Pike lost everything." Elspeth Perrin sniffed, her expression one of deep distaste. "I remember. Disgusting business. The man was a fool, and Kincaid was a predator. We heard the whole thing. Kincaid, laughing about how he'd finally owned the girl, said she'd be worth more than any stack of chips. Alton didn't even argue," May added, her voice a regretful whisper. "Just nodded like a man selling a horse. We told each other then. No good would come of it." "Would you be willing to say that tomorrow?" Nora asked. "In public, in front of the judge?" The sisters looked at each other. To speak of such things, to involve themselves in such a scandal, went against their reserved nature. But then they looked at Nora's determined face, and they thought of the young woman with the haunted eyes they had seen in the store. Elspeth gave a firm, decisive nod. "Some things are more important than keeping quiet," she said. Sawyer's part of the plan was quieter, more dangerous. He used his connections, the silent network of ranchers and hands who knew the territory. He learned that one of Kincaid's favorite card dealers, a man named Silas, was deeply in debt to a far more dangerous gambler in another town. Sawyer found Silas, not with a threat, but with a simple business proposition. He paid off the man's debt. In return, Silas delivered a small, leather-bound ledger. It was Kincaid's own private record of markers and debts, a book filled with his arrogant, looping signature. Sawyer tucked it into his saddlebag. It was a long shot, but if Kincaid's signature on the forged document was even slightly different from the dozens of examples in this book, it could be the final nail in his coffin. That evening, Reverend Eddins made another trip out to the dry lantern, at the kitchen table, by the steady light of the lamp. Lydia wrote out her formal testimony. She recounted every detail of her ordeal, from her stepfather's words to the rope burns on her wrists. Her language was plain, factual, and damning. When she was finished, she signed it, and the Reverend affixed his signature and the date, attesting that he had witnessed her sworn statement. The document was sealed in an envelope and given to a trusted writer, who set off immediately for Copper Trace, to deliver it directly into the hands of Judge Merrow before the hearing began. But Kincaid was not idle. He knew his legal foundation was a sham, so he bolstered it with the only other currency he truly understood: fear. A new man appeared in Mesquite Vale, a tall, gaunt figure with dead eyes and a long-barreled rifle he never let stray far from his hands. His name was Jago Penn, and the whispers that preceded him said he could shoot the eye out of a hawk from 300 yards. He didn't have to do anything. He just sat on the bench outside the saloon, cleaning his rifle, his cold gaze sweeping over everyone who passed. The message was clear: testify against Kincaid, and you might have to face Jago Penn on a long, lonely road home. The town grew quiet, the citizens suddenly finding their shoes very interesting whenever Penn looked their way. Rourke understood the power of fear, and he knew the only antidote was trust. That evening, he sat in the Mesquite Vale Tavern, not the saloon, and bought a round of drinks for a group of local ranchers. He didn't talk about the hearing directly. Instead, he began to tell a story, his voice casual. It was a story about a border campaign years ago, about a disastrous ambush. and about a young rancher who had charged back into a hail of gunfire to drag a wounded lawman, a younger Ellis Rourke, to safety. "Never saw a man so calm under fire," Rourke said, shaking his head as if still in disbelief. "Took 2 bullets in the leg himself and didn't make a sound, just kept saying we had to get back to the lines. That man was Sawyer Doone. A man's character is forged in fire, and I saw his forged that day. There's not a man in this territory I'd trust more to have my back." He raised his glass. 2 men of honor. The ranchers, who had been nervous about the new gunman in town, raised their glasses with him. Rourke had not just told a story, he had drawn a line in the sand. On one side was Sawyer Doone, a proven hero. On the other was Boar Kincaid, a man who had to hire his courage. Back at the ranch, as dusk settled, Sawyer sat on the porch. He took out the small, sharp knife he had used to cut the ropes from Lydia's wrists on that first day. He also took out a whetstone. With slow, deliberate strokes, he began to sharpen the blade. It was a quiet, meditative act. He wasn't preparing it for a fight. He was honoring it. This small piece of steel was the first thing that had come between Lydia and her captor. It was the first blow struck for her freedom. When he was finished, the blade had a razor's edge. He wiped it clean and carried it inside, placing it on the center of the mantelpiece, a silent, gleaming testament to how this all began. The night before the hearing was the longest of their lives. The house was quiet, but charged with a palpable tension. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In front of them were Lydia's notes, her ledger of facts. They went over her testimony again and again, preparing for the questions, the challenges, the accusations. Sawyer acted as the interrogator, his questions blunt and practical. "What if he says you went with him willingly? Then I will show them the scars on my wrists and ask if a willing bride needs to be bound. What if he says my marriage certificate is the fake one? Then we will ask the clerk, Mr. Yancey, under oath, which document he remembers stamping, and we'll compare the signatures." They worked for hours, honing her words, stripping away any hint of emotion, leaving only the hard, undeniable facts. They were not just a rancher and a refugee anymore. They were a legal team, preparing for the trial of their lives. Finally, exhausted, they fell silent. The lamp flickered, and the weight of the coming day settled heavily upon them. Lydia reached out and placed her hand over his on the table. He looked up, his eyes dark with concern for her. "Sawyer," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "If we get through tomorrow, if this is all finally over, this marriage certificate," she paused, searching for the right words, "it won't just be for blocking the storm anymore." The admission hung in the air between them, a declaration as binding as any legal document. She was no longer talking about a shield. She was talking about a home. Sawyer didn't speak for a long moment. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding an emotion so deep and profound it made her breath catch in her throat. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. A slow, rare smile. A smile that seemed to transform the tired, worried lines of his face, touched his lips. "I know," he said. And in those 2 quiet words, a new future was forged. The journey to Mesquite Vale began under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. A strange, oppressive stillness had fallen over the land, a heavy silence that was the prelude to violence. As they neared the jagged silhouette of Coyote Spire, the wind began to rise, not as a breeze, but as a low, mournful moan that grew steadily in pitch and power. Soon, the air was no longer air. It was a churning, blinding torrent of sand and dirt. The world was reduced to a roaring, brown twilight. Sawyer and Lydia dismounted, unable to ride in the face of the gale. They tied bandanas over their noses and mouths, pulling the brims of their hats low. Each step was a struggle against an invisible, relentless tide that sought to push them back, to scour them from the landscape. They led the horses, their heads bowed, leaning into the wind as if hauling a great, unseen weight. It felt as if they were dragging the entire weight of their pasts through that narrow, wind-blasted pass, the grit stinging their eyes and catching in their throats. The storm was a physical manifestation of their struggle, a chaotic battle they had to endure just to reach the field where the real war would be fought. They finally emerged from the pass onto the plains, the wind lessening slightly, but the air remained thick with a hazy, choking dust. Before them lay the wide, pale scar of Sable Creek's dry riverbed. It was a vast, open space, a killing floor with nowhere to hide. Sawyer's eyes, narrowed against the glare, scanned the far bank, a line of low, eroded bluffs and sparse, skeletal mesquite, a flicker of unnatural movement, a glint of metal where no metal should be, caught his attention. The sharp crack of a rifle shot was almost lost in the lingering howl of the wind. But the sonic whip crack that followed was unmistakable. A fist of invisible force slammed into Sawyer's hat, plucking it from his head and sending it spinning into the dust. A neat, round hole had been punched clean through the felt, an inch from his temple. There was no time for thought, only for the cold. Clear certainty of action. They were pinned down, exposed. The shot had come from the bluffs. It was Jago Penn. Lydia Sawyer's voice was a low, urgent command that cut through the wind. The horses make dust. He didn't have to explain. She understood instantly. While he unslung the rifle from his saddle, she grabbed the reins of both Mika and his own powerful gelding. With a raw-throated cry, she slapped the reins hard against their flanks, driving them forward into a panicked run, not away from the danger, but parallel to it. The horses' hooves, pounding in the deep, soft sand of the creek bed, threw up a massive, billowing cloud of dust, a churning, opaque screen that instantly obscured them from the sniper's view. As the curtain of dust erupted, Sawyer moved. He didn't run, he dove, hitting the ground and rolling, using the momentum to carry him into a shallow, winding arroyo that offered a few precious feet of cover. He was a creature of the earth, using the landscape his enemy had chosen as a weapon against him. He began to move up the gully, his rifle held low, his movement swift and silent, a wraith of vengeance closing in on the hidden marksman. He was flanking him, turning the hunter into the hunted. Lydia held her nerve, keeping the horses running back and forth, a chaotic, dust-churning dance of desperation. She was the diversion, the brave and fragile target who held the sniper's attention while the real threat closed in. From his perch, Jago Penn could see only the swirling cloud and the frantic movement of the animals within it. He fired again, a speculative shot that whined harmlessly overhead. He was growing impatient, unsure of where his primary target had gone. He never saw the third rider. Marshal Rourke came over the lip of the bluff from the east, having circled wide. Anticipating just such an ambush, he rode not with haste, but with a deadly, deliberate calm. Penn was so focused on the chaos in the creek bed below that he didn't hear the soft hoofbeats in the sand behind him until it was too late. "Drop the rifle, Penn." Rourke's voice was as cold and hard as a gun barrel. Jago Penn froze. He knew that voice. He knew the reputation of the man it belonged to. He slowly, carefully, placed his long rifle on the ground and raised his hands in the air. The ambush was over. They rode into Mesquite Vale not as victims, but as survivors, their faces grim and streaked with dust, their clothes bearing the marks of the struggle. The sandstorm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale, washed-out blue. A crowd had already gathered in the town square, drawn by the promise of a public hearing and the scent of conflict. They stood in tents, murmuring groups, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and quiet allegiance. Boar Kincaid was waiting for them. He stood on the wooden steps of the town hall, a position of assumed authority. In his hand, he held a piece of paper, which he waved like a banner of victory. His two hired guns, The now freed Ransom and the surly Bell stood a few paces behind him, their hands resting on their pistols, a blatant show of intimidation. "The law has arrived," Kincaid boomed, his voice dripping with false righteousness as he saw Judge Merrow's buggy pull up. "And it's time to settle this matter. This woman, Lydia, is my lawfully wedded wife. And this man, Dune, is holding her against her will. I have the proof right here." He held up the document for all to see. It was a crisp sheet of paper with florid, official-looking script, and at the bottom, a heavy, dark red wax seal. To the anxious townspeople, the embossed emblem of Silver Butte County looked utterly authentic. A wave of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. A legal document was a powerful thing. Kincaid's claim, which had been saloon gossip, now seemed to have the weight of law behind it. Sawyer started to step forward, his face a thundercloud, but Lydia put a hand on his arm, stopping him. This was her fight. She walked past him, her head held high, and stopped at the foot of the steps, forcing Kincaid to look down on her. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and steady that it cut through the murmuring of the crowd, silencing it completely. "That document is a lie," she said simply. Kincaid laughed. "A harsh, ugly sound. A lie. It has the county seal. Girl, are you calling Marshal Rourke and the whole damn county liars?" "No," Lydia replied, her gaze unwavering. I am saying that is not the county seal, and that is not Clerk Yancey's signature." She raised her voice, addressing the crowd and the newly arrived Judge Merrow. "I ask that the document be unsealed and examined, here, now, in the light of day, for all to see." The challenge was audacious. It shifted the focus from a dramatic claim to a forensic examination. Judge Merrow, a stern man with intelligent eyes, nodded his assent. "Let the document be brought forward." Rourke took the paper from a reluctant Kincaid and handed it to the judge, who examined it for a moment before passing it to the head of the town council. The crowd pressed forward, craning their necks to see. "Look closely," Lydia instructed, her voice ringing with a confidence that began to sway the onlookers. "Most of you have seen documents signed by our county clerk. You know his hand. Now look at that signature, and then look at the seal itself. A forger can try to copy a design, but he cannot copy the soul of the craftsman who made it." Nora Finch, a figure of unimpeachable integrity, stepped out from the crowd. In her hand, she held a large magnifying glass, which she used for examining the fine print on supply contracts. "Allow me," she said, her voice brooking no argument. She held the glass over the paper. The council head bent closer, his eyes widening. He passed the document and the glass to the man next to him. A low murmur of discovery began to spread. The signature, under magnification, was revealed to be a shaky, uncertain imitation of Yancey's familiar script. But the seal was the masterstroke. The intricate design of the official press included a small, stylized eagle. In the true seal, the eagle faced left. On this one, pressed from a crudely carved wooden copy, the eagle faced right. It was a small, fatal error. "This is a forgery," the council had declared, his voice ringing with outrage. All eyes turned to a pale, sweating figure at the edge of the crowd. It was the clerk, Yancey. Marshal Rourke began to walk slowly toward him, his expression grim. Yancey looked from the accusing faces of the townspeople to the cold fury in Kincaid's eyes. He broke. "It wasn't my idea," he squealed, his voice a high-pitched whine of terror. "He made me do it, Kincaid and the lawyer, Bramholt. He brought the wooden seal from Copper Trace. Said no one would ever know the difference." The confession landed like a physical blow. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of shock and anger. Kincaid's entire legal platform had just been demolished. His hired muscle, Ransom and Bell, seeing the tide turn so violently, began to back away, disassociating themselves from their employer. Kincaid stared at the scene, his face a mask of disbelief. which quickly contorted into pure, unrestrained fury. His cunning vanished, consumed by a lifetime of brutish arrogance. His carefully constructed plan was in ruins, his public humiliation complete. He lost control. "I paid for her," he roared, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. He pointed a trembling finger at Lydia. "I won her. Fair and square. A piece of paper is a piece of paper. She's mine." A dead, profound silence fell over the town square. It was a silence so deep it seemed to suck the very air from the lungs. The windmill on the edge of town, which had been turning slowly, gave a final, mournful creak and stopped, as if in shock, in his rage. Kincaid had just shouted a full confession to his true crime in front of the entire town, the town council, the marshal, and a circuit judge. He had admitted, with his own mouth, that he viewed Lydia not as a wife, but as property, a wager won, a thing to be owned. Rourke stopped walking toward Yancey. He turned and strode with calm, deliberate purpose toward the steps of the town hall. He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click loud and final in the stillness. Kincaid seemed to shrink, the blustering rage draining out of him, replaced by the dawning, horrified understanding of what he had just done. Sawyer moved to Lydia's side. He didn't touch her, but he stood slightly in front of her, a shield, just as he had on that first day, but this time was different. He was not standing alone against a single man. This time, as he looked out, he saw the faces in the crowd had changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a hard, protective anger on Lydia's behalf. Nora Finch stood with her arms crossed, glaring at Kincaid. The Perrin sisters nodded in grim vindication. The ranchers Rourke had spoken to stood taller, their hands resting on their own hips. They were no longer spectators. They were a wall of support. The community, which had once whispered about the strange girl at the widower's ranch, now stood with her. The storm had passed, and they were home. The community hearing was moved from the sun-baked square to the cavernous town warehouse. It was a space that smelled of milled lumber, burlap, and the faint, sweet scent of last year's grain. Rough wooden benches had been arranged in rows, and they were filled with the citizens of Mesquite Vale and the surrounding ranches. They were not here for a water rights dispute anymore. They were here to witness a reckoning. Judge Merrow took his place not at a grand judicial bench, but at a sturdy workbench set upon a raised platform. He was a man who wore his authority with a quiet gravity, his duster still filmed with the dust of his journey. He did not have a traditional gavel. Instead, he picked up a heavy wooden mallet and struck it once against a block of oak. The sharp, solid sound echoed through the vast space, calling the makeshift court to order. There was no jury of peers. In this place, the entire community was the jury. Boer Kincaid, his lawyer Bramholt, and the trembling clerk Yancey were brought to the front and seated on a separate bench, a trio of sour guilt under the watchful eye of Marshal Rourke. "We are here," Judge Merrow began, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the warehouse, "to address a series of grave allegations. We will proceed not with elaborate legal maneuvering, but with the simple presentation of facts. The truth has a clarity that requires no ornament. I will hear first from Mrs. Lydia Doone." A hush fell over the crowd as Lydia rose and walked to the center of the floor. She did not look at Kincaid or her stepfather. She looked directly at the judge, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She began to speak, her voice not loud, but imbued with a clear, resonant strength that compelled everyone to listen. She did not describe her fear in lurid detail. She did not speak of the darkness of her despair. Instead, she presented the facts with a stark and courageous simplicity. "On the evening of the 3rd of May, she began, my stepfather, Mr. Alton Pike, informed me that my person had been used as a settlement for a gambling debt owed to Mr. Boer Kincaid. I was given no choice in the matter." She spoke of being bound, her wrists tied in front of her. The rope was coarse, It was tied in a knot I did not recognize. She described being forced onto a wagon and taken from her home. She spoke of the long, terrifying journey, and of the moment she had worked the knot loose and frayed the rope to its breaking point. When the wagon slowed to cross a dry wash, I broke the last strand and I ran. I did not stop running until I reached the broken fence of the Dry Lantern Ranch. She finished her testimony, her head held high. She had not presented herself as a victim demanding pity, but as a survivor stating the unassailable truth of her experience. "Mr. Sawyer Doone," the judge called next. Sawyer stood, his large frame seeming to fill the space. He walked to the center and stood near Lydia, a protective, solid presence. His testimony was as spare and sturdy as he was. "I was on my porch," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "I saw her come through the fence. She was exhausted and hurt. She fell." He described cutting the frayed rope from her wrist. He spoke of carrying her inside and placing his boots against the door. "She was terrified. I gave her a coat for the cold and a cup of water for the thirst." He paused, and his eyes met Lydia's for a brief, significant moment. "I told her, 'You're safe here,' and I meant to keep that promise." He said nothing more. He had offered no opinions, no accusations, only the simple facts of shelter and safety. The contrast between the two testimonies was devastating. One was a story of brutal transaction and forced captivity. The other was a story of unconditional sanctuary. Judge Merrow then turned his gaze to the clerk. "Mr. Yancey." Yancey shuffled forward, his face the color of old parchment. He could not look at anyone. Under the judge's patient but relentless questioning, the entire sordid story came tumbling out. He confessed that the lawyer, Bramholt, had approached him, offering him $10 to misplace the official county seal for an hour. "He gave me the wooden one," Yancey stammered, his voice cracking. "Said it was just for a land deed. I didn't know what it was really for until I heard the talk. I swear it." A low hiss of contempt and disgust rippled through the assembled townspeople. "Tuh, Mr. Bramholt," the judge said, his voice laced with ice. "You are an officer of the court, sworn to uphold the law. Would you care to explain this?" The lawyer, his face slick with sweat, rose to his feet. He attempted to cloak his crime in the guise of legal complexity. "Your Honor, there are many customs on the frontier. Contracts can take many forms. A marker, a pledge. These things have historically been considered binding." He got no further. Judge Merrow struck the oak block with his mallet, the sharp crack silencing Bramholt instantly. "Let me be unequivocally clear, sir," the judge said, leaning forward, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "There is no custom that allows for the buying and selling of human beings. There is no contract that can be written for the ownership of a person's life. What you call custom, the law calls a crime. Sit down." Bramholt collapsed back onto the bench as if his legs had been cut out from under him. Finally, the judge's gaze settled on Boar Kincaid. "Mr. Kincaid, this morning, in the town square, you were heard to shout, and I quote, 'I paid for her, she's mine.' Would you care to elaborate on the nature of that financial transaction?" Kincaid, who had been simmering with a sullen rage, leaped to his feet. "It was a figure of speech. She was promised to me. I had a marker from her stepfather. She belonged with me." He began to rant, his voice rising, trying to reclaim the narrative through sheer volume and bluster. He was interrupted by the calm, clear voice of Nora Finch. "Judge Merrow," she said, standing up from her seat in the front row. "Perhaps this might clarify the nature of Mr. Kincaid's payment." In her hand, she held a small, leather-bound ledger, the one Sawyer had procured. "This is Mr. Kincaid's own record of his gambling affairs. On the 3rd of May, there is an entry. It records the cancellation of a $200 debt from Mr. Alton Pike in the column for payment received. There is a single, chilling annotation. It reads, 1 daughter. She then held up a separate sheet of paper. "And this is the original marker from that night, which confirms the debt. The signature of Alton Pike is a perfect match to the one in the ledger." Kincaid stared at the book, his face draining of all color. He sagged, defeated, the fight going out of him as he was confronted with his own meticulous, damning records. He had been undone by his own arrogance. "Mr. Alton Pike," the judge called out into the silent warehouse. A space cleared in the crowd as Alton Pike was urged forward. He walked like a man in a dream, his eyes hollow. He stopped beside his stepdaughter but could not bring himself to look at her. His gaze was fixed on the dusty floorboards at his feet. "Mr. Pike?" the judge asked, his voice softer now, almost weary. "Did you, on the 3rd of May, use your stepdaughter, Lydia, as payment to settle a gambling debt of $200 to Mr. Kincaid?" Alton Pike's shoulders shook. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He looked up, his eyes sweeping over the faces of his neighbors, faces that were now cold with judgment. There was no escape. The saloon, the cards, the whiskey-fueled bravado, it had all evaporated, leaving only this moment of stark, public shame. He looked, finally, at Lydia. He saw not the child he had failed, but the strong, resolute woman she had become, and his last defense crumbled into dust. "Yes," he whispered, the admission a bare thread of sound. "I did." The confession, though expected, settled over the room with a heavy finality. Judge Merrow let the silence sit for a long moment before he rose to his full height to deliver his judgment. "This hearing is concluded," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The findings of this community and this court are as follows. Any and all documents purporting a marriage between Boar Kincaid and Lydia Pike are hereby declared fraudulent and are rendered null and void. Mr. Yancey, for his role in this conspiracy, is stripped of his position and will serve 30 days in the county jail. Mr. Bramholt, you are a disgrace to your profession. You are hereby disbarred from practicing law in this territory, and I will see to it you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Mr. Kincaid, for the crimes of coercion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the abhorrent act of attempting to enforce a contract of human bondage, you will serve a term of no less than 5 years in the federal penitentiary." A gasp went through the crowd. It was a sentence of incredible severity, a clear message that the frontier was not a lawless place. "Mr. Pike," the judge continued, his gaze falling on the broken man. "Your crime is one of the heart, and for that, no prison is sufficient punishment. You will, however, pay a fine to the county, and you will serve 1 year of public labor, mending the very roads and fences of the community you have shamed." The verdicts had been delivered. Justice, swift and certain, had been done. But there was one last piece of business. Judge Merrow's expression softened as he turned his full attention to Lydia. "Mrs. Doone," he said, his voice gentle, "you have endured an ordeal that no person should have to face. You have shown a courage that is an example to us all. The law has now freed you from all false claims, but it leaves one final question. You are a free woman. Where do you wish to make your home?" Every eye in the warehouse turned to her. The question was a formality, but it was a vital one. It was the public affirmation of her agency, her right to choose her own path. She stood in the center of the vast room, the silent focus of 100 gazes. She looked at Judge Merrow, a man of law who had given her justice. She looked at her stepfather, a man of weakness who had given her away. Her eyes then moved to Boar Kincaid, a man of brutish greed who had tried to own her. Then she turned her head and looked at Sawyer Doone. He was not looking at the judge or the crowd. He was looking only at her, his face open, his expression one of quiet, unwavering support, making no demands, offering no persuasion, and, in his eyes, she saw her answer. She turned back to the judge, but her gaze dropped to her own feet, to the sturdy, scuffed leather boots that Nora Finch had given her. Boots that were now covered in the familiar red dust of the Dry Lantern Ranch. "At home," she said, her voice quiet but carrying with absolute certainty through the silent room. For a moment, nobody moved. The simple power of her words settled over them. Then, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the crowd. A bench creaked as someone shifted their weight. It was the sound of a community breathing a sigh of relief, of a story finding its right and proper end. It was the sound of a woman, finally and truly, coming home. That evening, the town of Mesquite Vale did something it had not done in a very long time. It celebrated. It wasn't an organized, formal affair, but a spontaneous eruption of communal relief and joy. Someone dragged a few fiddles and a banjo out onto the boardwalk in front of Nora Finch's store, and soon a small, energetic band was sawing out lively tunes that echoed through the clean night air. Barrels were rolled out to serve as tables, and women brought out freshly baked cakes and pies. A large fire was built in the square, and soon the irresistible smell of roasting corn filled the street. Oil lamps were hung from awnings and porch posts, their soft, golden light pooling in the dust, looking like a handful of fallen stars scattered across the town. It was a celebration of justice, but it was more than that. It was a celebration of community, of a town that had been fractured by fear and suspicion, and was now, in this shared moment, mending itself. People who had been casting nervous glances at each other all week were now laughing and sharing a plate of food. The dark shadow of Kincaid and his hired menace had been lifted, and in its absence, the simple goodness of the townsfolk was allowed to shine. Marshal Rourke stood near the fire, a tin cup in his hand. He watched Lydia as she accepted a slice of apple pie from Nora Finch, a genuine, unguarded smile on her face. He saw Sawyer standing nearby, not joining in the laughter, but watching over her with a quiet, profound contentment that was a language all its own. Rourke raised his cup. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice carrying over the music. The fiddles quieted, and all eyes turned to him. "There are a lot of things a man can drink to out here. To a good rain, a healthy herd, a lucky hand at cards." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces lit by the firelight. "But tonight, I want to toast something more important. I want to toast to justice, and I want to toast to the homes that know how to open their doors in a storm, and to the courage it takes to step through them." He looked directly at Sawyer and Lydia. "To the dunes." A chorus of "To the dunes" rose from the crowd, and 100 cups were lifted in their honor. Lydia felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warm and welcome heat that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of acceptance, of belonging. They stayed for a little while longer, soaking in the genuine goodwill of the community, but the day had been long and emotionally draining. As the music swelled again, Sawyer caught Lydia's eye and gave a slight nod toward the edge of town. She understood. They quietly made their farewells, their thanks swallowed by the lively music and laughter, and slipped away from the bright circle of light, melting into the cool, embracing darkness of the prairie. The ride back to the Dry Lantern Ranch was a silent one. The night was clear and cool, the sky a vast canopy of brilliant, diamond-hard stars. The wind, which had been their enemy for so long, was now just a soft, gentle breeze that whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. As they drew closer to home, another sound joined the whisper of the wind, the slow, rhythmic, and deeply comforting groan of the windmill. It was no longer the sound of thirst or hardship. Tonight, it sounded like a lullaby, the steady, turning heartbeat of their land. They left the horses in the corral and walked to the house, stopping on the familiar wooden porch. They didn't go inside. Instead, they stood for a moment, two silent figures in the starlight, simply breathing in the peace of their sanctuary. The raucous sounds of the town celebration were now just a faint, happy murmur on the edge of hearing. Here, there was only the vast, quiet solitude of the ranch. Sawyer went inside and returned a moment later with a heavy wool blanket. He draped it around both their shoulders as they sat down on the top step of the porch, their sides pressed together, sharing its warmth. "That was a good thing," Lydia said softly, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "What the town did?" "They're good people," Sawyer replied. "Sometimes they just need to be reminded of it." They fell silent again, comfortable in the quiet. After a while, Lydia spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "We talked about our marriage being a shield, a way to block the storm." She looked at him, her face illuminated by the soft starlight. "The storm is over now, Sawyer." "I know," he said. "The paper is still there." She continued, thinking aloud. "But it feels different now. It feels heavier, more real." "The paper never changed," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We did." Her gaze fell upon the mantelpiece, visible through the open doorway. There, gleaming in the faint light from the embers in the hearth, lay the small, sharp knife he had placed there. She stood up and walked into the house, her boots making a soft sound on the wooden floor. She ran her fingers over the smooth, worn handle. She came back out onto the porch, holding the knife in her palm. "This," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "is where my freedom began. With this blade, when you cut that rope." Sawyer looked at the knife, then at her. He stood up and took it gently from her hand. He went to the large wooden chest in the corner of the room, the one that had held his wife's guitar. He unlocked it with a small iron key. Instead of putting the knife inside, he simply placed it on top of the closed lid. He turned and took a small, beautifully carved wooden box from a nearby shelf, a box she had never seen him open. He placed the knife inside, closed the lid, and turned the tiny key in its lock. He came back and sat beside her, placing the locked box on the step. "The freedom isn't in the steel anymore, Lydia," he said, his voice soft but certain. "The rope is gone. The freedom is in us now, in here." He gently tapped his chest, over his heart. "We don't need to keep the blade sharp anymore." His words, his gesture, were a profound promise. He was not just locking away a tool, he was locking away the past. He was declaring that she was no longer the woman who needed to be cut free, she was just free. A wave of emotion so powerful it took her breath away washed over her. She looked at his strong, kind face, at the gentle wisdom in his eyes, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that her heart had not just followed her mind. It had galloped ahead and had been waiting here for her all along. She leaned into him, her head finding the familiar hollow of his shoulder. He shifted the blanket, wrapping it more securely around them both. The cool night air touched their faces, a stark contrast to the warmth cocooned beneath the wool. Crickets began their nightly chorus, a steady, pulsing rhythm that seemed to sync with their own slowing heartbeats. He tilted her chin up with a gentle finger, and his lips met hers. It was not the urgent, searching kiss of the rainy night in the kitchen. This was different. It was a long, slow, and deeply certain kiss, a kiss of homecoming. It was a kiss that held no questions, only answers. There was a quiet strength in it, a tenderness that spoke of shared hardship and hard-won peace. His warm breath mingled with hers, a shared life in the cool night air. His hand, large and calloused, found hers, and their fingers intertwined, not in a tight, desperate grip, but in a slow, respectful, and perfect fit. It was a moment of profound, PG-rated intimacy, a deep and gentle connection that needed no fanfare to declare its power. When they finally broke the kiss, she rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. The world was utterly perfect. The past was a locked box. The future was an open door. And the present was this man, this porch, this home. She opened her eyes and looked at him, a soft, wondrous smile on her lips. she whispered, her voice a warm invitation that held all the promise of the future. This time, it was not a desperate plea born of fear, a plea to get inside and away from danger. This was an invitation to stay, to begin. "Let's go inside, husband." Sawyer stood utterly still for a beat, a look of profound, stunned wonder on his face. He looked like a man who had been wandering through a desolate desert for years and had just stumbled upon a miracle. A cool, clear spring he had long since stopped believing could exist. Then, a slow, rare, and incredibly beautiful smile transformed his rugged features, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Wife," he said, the single word filled with a universe of love and acceptance. They stood up and, together, they stepped over the threshold of the house. As they did, a draft from the open door seemed to catch the flame of the oil lamp on the table, making it flare up, suddenly brighter, casting their joined shadows long and strong against the wall. On the mantelpiece, the official marriage certificate rested in its place. It was no longer a shield. It was not a contract or a strategy. It was a choice, freely and deliberately made. In the far, far distance, the faint, rhythmic hoofbeats of Marshal Rourke's night patrol could be heard for a moment before fading into the vast silence of the prairie. The storm, in all its forms, was finally over. But outside, the windmill continued its slow, steady turning, a faithful sentinel keeping watch over the ranch. It turned because the wind blew, and it turned because that was its purpose. It turned because life, now, would go on. Sawyer gently took Lydia's hand in his. He turned it over, palm up, and looked at the faint, silvery scars that circled her wrist. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to them, a kiss that was not of passion, but of reverence. He was kissing the marks of her survival, the testament of her strength. He was transforming a symbol of her bondage into a badge of her victory. The frame freezes there, on Lydia's face, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of joy, a radiant, triumphant smile gracing her lips, her features bathed in the warm, golden glow of the lamplight. The revenge is complete, and the love has just begun. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We'd love to share our thoughts together. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and liking this video. Your support, especially by hitting that hype button, helps this story reach more listeners just like you.